Hello, I'm Chris Placitella, and I am here in Red Bank, New Jersey. I serve as counsel to a number of sheet metal worker locals here in New Jersey and Pennsylvania. And one of the things I've been asked to do is to present an asbestos program to the apprentice training programs for the locals that we represent. And it occurred to me that it's very important information, and that the information should be made available on a far more broad scale. And that's why I'm doing this video. The problem is that most people who are in the trade now, who are starting in the trades now, don't really know or understand that they are still being exposed to asbestos and creating risks for themselves and their families down the line. So the purpose of this video is to educate those people who are in the trades who may not really understand or realize the things that they are encountering giving them asbestos exposure. So what I'm going to do in order to make this presentation is to actually share my screen and go through the PowerPoint with you, explaining exactly what you need to know. So, is the concern about asbestos over? And why should I be concerned? And the answer is no, the concern is not over, and you need to be concerned. Compliance with OSHA regulations that are in place does not guarantee your safety. NIOSH, as early as 1976, explained that just 1 day of exposure to asbestos may be enough to cause mesothelioma. What you have in front of you here is actually a graph that was put together in a medical article showing you that mortality from asbestos, and you can see mesothelioma on the top, asbestosis on the bottom, won't even peak until the year 2015, which is amazing when you think about all the disease that has come up to this point in time. And now we're only on the downscale starting next year, which is dramatic. Here's another slide showing the number of deaths per year that can be anticipated from mesothelioma, asbestosis, lung cancer, and GI cancer, up to 10,000 deaths per year. That's about 30 deaths per day. This is another, I thought, telling map, which shows mortality from asbestos exposure. The brown showing the concentration of where deaths occur, and you can see it is in the industrial centers around the United States, concentrated heavily in the Northeast and in Florida, California and Texas, and Louisiana. And Florida is probably from all the people who have actually retired to Florida, who worked in a lot of these centers. And it's interesting that sheet metal workers have recently shown as much mortality from mesothelioma as any other trade. Now, is it possible to be exposed to asbestos even today? The answer is definitely yes. And where, as a sheet metal worker, can I go and encounter asbestos? Well, here's just a diagram of which shows all of the potential places where asbestos-containing products were actually installed in a typical building. There are a number of asbestos-containing products that are discontinued that may still be encountered on the job. Sheet metal workers can be exposed to pipe covering when they're up above in the plenum, spray that was put in years ago in the 1960s and early 1970s. This is something that you really need to be aware of. Flexible duct connectors, back in the 60s and the 70s. These were put in all over the United States and may very well still be in place. So where there is high heat, those flexible duct connectors may very well have contained asbestos. Mostly out of circulation now are welding gloves, which were asbestos, but sometimes in shops, in particular, those gloves may be hanging around, and you should know that those gloves can create real exposure. Same thing with asbestos blankets. They should be discontinued, but there are occasions when they will still be in shops. And what happens is they fray and release asbestos fibers. There was a product once known as Ductmate that had asbestos in the product, discontinued in the late 70s and early 80s, but you can still encounter that, and you need to know that it is out there. Asbestos cement air duct pipe and asbestos cement pipe, you need to be aware at one point contained asbestos and has the potential for creating exposure. Roofing cement is another product that you need to be aware of. There was a product known as galbestos, got the name from asbestos, and it was used in siding and other places. And when that stuff frays, it can in fact create asbestos exposure, and it's still all over the place in the United States. At one point, asbestos paper was installed over ductwork, and that paper is now fraying, and you need to be careful. You can actually see the fibers sticking out. There were products for lapping that were installed that contained asbestos. Then I go to specific applications, for, like in a pharmaceutical laboratory. And this slide you have here actually came out of a deposition I took. And the yellow shows all the places in this pharmaceutical lab where asbestos was installed. It was kind of like an asbestos tomb. It was in the countertops, the doors, the flooring, the ductwork, the overhead hoods. And so if you go in and you have to do a repair in a pharmaceutical laboratory, just be aware that if the products were installed long ago, they may very well contain asbestos, and you need to be extremely careful on rip out. This is a product of great concern and something that has been long forgotten. You know, if you encounter a piece of pipe covering in a work setting and someone says it's asbestos, they kind of sometimes even shut down the job while they take care of that, and that's a good thing. But what happened in the 60s and through the mid to late 70s was that almost every seam that was put in with drywall had asbestos in it. And you can see here in this particular diagram all of the seams in a typical room. All of those white seams before painting had some level of asbestos in it. Now, that has been out of practice for many years now. But when people go into work sites and they knock out walls that were put in the 60s and the 70s with no protection, that creates a potential for tremendous exposure. So you really need to be aware, if you're in that kind of environment, that you may be subject to serious asbestos exposure. Now let's talk a little bit about the medicine. Asbestos fibers that get into your lung are invisible when they are inhaled. So the fibers that you can, or the dust that you can actually see, that's not even the asbestos fibers that are hurting you. It's the stuff in your lung that you cannot see. So they enter the body and they go into the far reaches of the lung known as the alveoli, and that actually causes asbestosis and lung cancer. The alveoli, if you think about it, as you can see in this diagram, are like little grapes or bunches of grapes turned upside down. And there are millions of these inside your body. So the asbestos fibers are inhaled through the mouth and the nose. They go down through the trachea and into the lung. Now, the thing that you have to remember is that asbestos fibers, I say, are like a 20-year time bomb. Asbestos fibers that you inhale today will not show up for a minimum of 15 years, up to 40 years from the time of your exposure. And that's really the dangerous part about all this, because you get young people that come into the trades and they think they're invincible because they don't understand that what they may be encountering is a silent killer. And those asbestos fibers get into their lungs, and 20 years or 30 years or even 40 years later, they show up and cause major problems. One of the big issues that asbestos causes is mesothelioma. Mesothelioma is a cancer of the lining of the lung. And what happens is that, or even the abdomen, the asbestos gets out to the outer reaches of the lung and sits there. And 20, 30, or even 40 years later, the mesothelioma can occur. And the big concern about mesothelioma, unlike, say, asbestosis, which is a scarring of the lung, or lung cancer, is that mesothelioma can be caused by very little asbestos exposure. And that risk is presented not only for the workers, but for their families. So if you bring asbestos contaminated clothing home on your family, to your family rather, they are at risk. And probably today, 20% of the cases that we have involve family members with mesothelioma. So people always ask, when were the dangers of asbestos first known? And the scary part is that, and did the industry know that workers and their families were at risk? Well, here's an example of a memo from between Raybestos Manhattan and Johns Manville going way back to 1935, where the executives in the company are talking about asbestos. And the executive from Raybestos that was making asbestos-containing brakes at the time writes to Johns Manville and says, well, I think the less said about asbestos, the better off we are. And then Bendix, back in the 1960s, writes to the director of purchasing, and Bendix was making brakes at the time, and they're talking about asbestos, and the executive says, my answer to the problem is, if you have enjoyed a good life while working with asbestos products, why not die from it? There's got to be some cause. And then this one is extremely sensitive in terms of sheet metal workers, and there's one industry executive writing to another in 1971, I say laughing at the workers, saying, sheet metal workers constructing new air ducts high over asbestos area, no masks. These fellows are getting plenty of asbestos for their lungs to chew on. So did they know? Yes, they knew. And insurance companies actually predicted how many people would get sick. One insurance company predicted that 400,000 plaintiffs would generate 2 million cases at some point in time. Back in 1973, the director of the Asbestos Information Association, which was a trade group, made a speech to the trade group. And he talked about what they did. They actually did a survey of what the problems were with asbestos, and this was after OSHA. And the director of the trade group said, well, we have good news and bad news. The bad news is that we predict that 25,000 people are going to die from asbestos. Now that prediction turned out to be grossly underestimate it. But clearly they knew that people were going to get sick. And then he went on to tell the group, and the good news is that despite all the negative articles on asbestos health that have appeared in the press over the past half dozen years, very few people have been paying attention. Now, what was done in response? No warnings, and that's the problem. People did not know. Even after OSHA, people did not know. So what is the answer here? The answer here is education. You need to educate both workers. You need to understand what your legal rights are, and you need to understand how to prevent exposure in the future. So you have two time bombs that you need to recall. One is the medical time bomb that I told you 20 plus years before you're going to get sick. And the second big time bomb is the statute of limitations. The statute of limitations, and this goes for auto accidents and construction accidents as well, but in this case, you generally have 2 years from the time you are diagnosed with an asbestos-related disease to bring a lawsuit. And somebody comes into my office 2 years and 1 day, it's too late. So it's 2 years for pain and suffering, and you get another 2 years, God forbid, if you should die. Now, if you're exposed today, you don't have to worry about what's going to happen to you in 2 years. Family members that you've had or coworkers that you've had who've been in the trade for a long time. And if you hear of them coming down with an asbestos disease, asbestosis, lung cancer, or mesothelioma, you should educate them and let them know that they have a 2-year statute of limitations. It's the 2-year time bomb that may take away their legal rights. And that's an extremely important thing to keep in mind. So what I say is that you need to be vigilant, understand what your rights are, understand the statute of limitations. Don't go into a job site assuming if the job is an old job that there is no potential for exposure. Give yourself the following assumption. If the building was built before 1980, have a light bulb go off in your mind that you really need to pay attention to what's going on. After 1980, probably less so. And if you believe that you might be exposed to asbestos or there is asbestos on the job, tell your foreman. Don't create panic on the job. What we're here to do is to try to prevent exposure, not shut down good work. I firmly believe that people today, your employers, the general contractors and the building owners, they don't want exposure to happen. This isn't like the people that were involved back in the 60s and the 70s and were callous. Generally, people today want to do the right thing, but you need to be the eyes and ears for yourself and for your coworkers. I hope this presentation was helpful. If you should have any questions, feel free to contact me. My phone number is up here on the website. You can also contact us at cprlaw.com or call our offices in New Jersey or Philadelphia, and we're more than happy to help you and answer any questions. Thank you and have a great day.